Bringer, and I'm very happy to introduce this talk. The 1977, am I vibing, or is that just the way it sounds up here? Is it okay? In the 1977 issue of Studio Potter devoted to porcelain, John Reeve wrote an article, More Notes on Porcelain, which was widely read, admired, copied, we're talking Xerox here, and shared. Reeve was the go-to guy for porcelain at that time, and perhaps more than anyone else then, was responsible for introducing studio potters to its history and guiding them through its challenges. In the article, Reeve goes on for almost 7 pages about the history and chemistry of different types of porcelain, about translucency, plasticity, and unity formulas. Then he ends with this. Well, that's all for now, and it all makes my head ache. I'm convinced of the value of all that information and of the need for somebody to write it down, but it leaves me deflated and depressed, dissatisfied. What makes my head ache is the uneasy sense that all this saying leaves what is really important unsaid, and that what is really important hardly ever gets written about. So here at the end, just a word or two to salve my conscience. The clay doesn't matter. Neither does the glazing nor the firing. The clay of itself doesn't care whether it's good or bad quality, porcelain or raku, behind glass in a museum or lying on a beach. If the pots that you make from all this wonderful clay, if the pieces themselves and their nature are not at or near the center of your concern and consciousness, if they are not your way of trying to understand, reflect, represent what is really important about things, about no things, about how people can relate to things and to people and to their own image or perception of God, then it doesn't matter a damn whether you have porcelain clay or shit between your fingers. The result will be the same, just another bit of more or less decorative flotsam polluting the universe. The technology is a support, a tool, a grammar, but it is no more than that. No matter how cleverly we are able to employ it, the very best we can hope for is that it will help to make good pots better. It will never make bad pots good. This is why we need to know about John Reeve, and to have his pots and his story restored to our history. We owe Nora Vaillant a debt of gratitude for assembling and bringing us this life and this material.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome everyone. The first time I met John Reeve, he told me that for him, making pots was a vocation, not a skill or a trade, but a vocation. He said, the soul that goes into the pot comes out of the pot. When you are throwing pots, there is an emptying, a letting go of, and that's where the pots come from. They come out of that empty space. It is no time to think about what the pot is like or what you are like or anything. It is time to let your energy, your spirit, go into that activity. Reeve's insight, talent, and charisma inspired potters across the United States, Canada, and England over the course of his 50-year career. But when I started this research, he had really fallen into obscurity. In fact, until recently, when you Googled his name, about the only thing to come up was this 16th century monk. And I think John would have liked that. But it has been a real detective plot unearthing Reeve's story. For me, it all began with this bucket of glaze. I was in art school in Philadelphia, and it was 1993. This was a glaze I used often, and I wanted to know more. Who's Reeve, and where can I see some of his pots? This was the days before the internet, so I went to the library. and needless to say, I found nothing. A few years later, while taking a course with Clary Ilian at Penland School of Crafts, she gave a slideshow one evening, and there was John Reeve, the mystery potter. I found out he, like Clary, had been an apprentice at the Leach Pottery in England. He was still alive, but she had no idea where he was living or if he was still making pots. I was stymied again. The following year, I moved to Canada for graduate school. To my surprise, I soon discovered that John Reeve was originally from Canada and had for many years lived in Vancouver, first as an art student and later making pots and teaching. The plot thickened. I picked up the trail, and the history of the Leach legacy in British Columbia became the topic of my master's thesis. Reeve was the first Canadian to apprentice with Bernard Leach. In all, there were a total of 4 from Canada who completed 2-year apprenticeships in St. Ives. And it turns out they each attended the Vancouver School of Art. Upon their return to the West Coast, they influenced a generation of BC potters, defining the Canadian Leach diaspora, somewhat akin to Warren MacKenzie's influence in Minnesota. I'd like to mention now that many of the images you'll be seeing today come directly from John's collection of slides and photographs, including this one here. John Reeve was born in 1929 in the small town of Barrie, Ontario, about an hour's drive from Toronto. As the eldest of 2 children and the only boy, he was expected to take over the family jewelry store, which he did for 6 years upon graduating from high school. Yearning for more, he took off for the West Coast at the age of 24 to attend the Vancouver School of Art. Older than most other students, he read poetry and talked about philosophy and seemed to know what a beatnik actually was. He even looked the part. He majored in drawing and painting before discovering the ceramics department. And once he got on the wheel, he was hooked. Having read a potter's book, John decided Bernard Leach was one of the best in the world to study with, and so he boarded a freighter for England in 1958. He worked for Colin Pearson and Harry Davis before being taken on for a 2-year apprenticeship at the Leach Pottery. His daughter, Hannah Bernadette, was born shortly after he and his wife, Donna Balma, arrived in St. Ives, and Donna is pictured here beside Leach. Also at the pottery at that time were Leach's wife, Janet Darnell, Kenneth Quick, Hamida's son, Atsuya, Richard and Dinah Batterham, and later the Australian potter, Gwen Hanson-Piggott, who made pots back-to-back with Reeve. She made the bottoms and he made the lids of the standardware casseroles. Gwen wistfully described to me how John liked to sing old torch songs when he threw pots. Just months before her death, she exhorted me to tell Reeve's story, recalling their shared experiences at the Leach Pottery. She said, even at that time, you could see John's style. She was jealous of his pots. They were so free and relaxed. She wanted to make pots like that. Reeve wrote movingly about his time as an apprentice, describing the first 6 weeks as one of the hardest things he ever did, other than learning to meditate. He remembered something breaking in him, but the resulting discipline enabled him to acquire exceptional skills. Toward the end of his apprenticeship, plans were being made for him to go to Japan and possibly study with Hamida, when, ironically, Reeve ended up being hired as Hamida's replacement, teaching the 1961 summer session at the University of British Columbia back in Vancouver. Here he is with fellow Canadian apprentice Glenn Lewis, firing a small raku kiln he built. And these pots were made during his 2 years teaching at the university. Reeve's initial experiences as a teacher led him to develop his vision for a new kind of communal artist pottery. The Canadian Arts Council awarded Reeve a fellowship to try out his experiment in England. In his proposal, he wrote, "This would not be a commercial pottery in any sense, but a pottery where artist potters would work in separate studios and where young potters could come to work after they've had their basic training and learn how to set up potteries and kilns of their own. His desire to transmit what he'd learned at the Leach Pottery was important to him. He told me it's not okay to take the goodies and run after receiving that kind of gift, that kind of privilege of the training he went through. He wanted to create an apprentice-type workshop, but more cooperative and less hierarchical than the Leach Pottery, presaging the interest in communal ventures that sprang up later in the decade, alongside the counterculture movement. But when Reeve came up with the idea in 1962, there were few options for practical training of this kind. Reeve's proposal aimed to fill a gap he perceived in art education. His thinking was ahead of its time. On his way back to England, he took Leach's advice and stopped in to see another former apprentice, Warren MacKenzie, in Minnesota. This began a deep and lasting friendship. John and his family spent 9 months in Stillwater, while John worked in MacKenzie's studio to complete a large commission for the University of Toronto, which included these tall vases. MacKenzie's wife, Alex, had just died, and Warren was also planning to return to England for a sabbatical year. The two of them arrived at the Leach Pottery in 1963, where they spent the summer in the company of Hamada and former apprentices who returned for the occasion of Hamada's visit from Japan. Reeve is in the back row with a child on his shoulders in the center, and MacKenzie with the mustache on the left. On weekends, MacKenzie and Glenn Lewis helped Reeve look for a place to start a pottery. They found Longlands in Devon, a farm in the village of Hennick, which was listed in the Doomsday Book. The farm, built in 1450 and remodeled in 1600, was in need of a little TLC. It was purchased with the help of friends who stuck around, helping to convert the barn into a pottery where they could all work. In those first magical years, several potters passed through and stayed a while to make pots and fire the large and temperamental oil and wood-fueled kiln. Here is MacKenzie seated at a leach wheel, and here is Clary Ilian swooping over her pots in about 1965. Recalling Reeve's work at the time, she told me, they had a robustness that wasn't in anyone else's work. Chunky, sensuous, soft but austere. They had a character. So many of us make pots in that tradition, and they can begin to seem interchangeable, but not John's. There is something about them that is unmistakable, about the meat of them, the touch on the surface, the pacing of a curve, the choices of the thickness of the walls and the edges. Here is John, alone in the studio, but he really preferred working in the company of others, finding it energizing and stimulating. His work matured, and with the show at London's prestigious Primavera Gallery, critical attention followed. These pots, made at Longlands between 1964 and 1972, echo shapes he continued to explore throughout his career, such as these large round vases, generous volumetric orbs with rolled rims of varying widths and slopes, and expansive bellies, unself-conscious imperfections evocative of Korean full moon jars. He also tried his hand at making earthenware in the English slipware tradition with a twist, like this charger complete with Beatles lyrics. And he was having fun with lugs and handles, their casual, asymmetric placement lending a playful quality and conveying his sense of humor. Around this time, John described a pot he made, which was particularly pleasing to him, and which he knew would not find favor with Leach. He called the style Holy Sung, but all out of whack, as in the Chinese wares from the Sung dynasty, whose pots were so highly praised by his teacher. In a 1965 letter, he wrote, "The pot is not very cool or professional looking. Instead, its rhythms change from inch to inch, not predictable, not smooth, the top in scale with another size of pot. The changes are in the musical sense of transitions from one section or statement to another. Most of these things I see as the reasons to like it. It has that swing without which it don't mean a thing. He went on, it's all very well to claim that your work is mainly influenced by the Japanese and all that jazz, which is true. But here you are engaged in a tearing away from all the classic canons. I don't think it denies any of Bernard's teaching. Indeed, I think it depends upon that groundwork. I think that if there is a valuable Leach tradition, it will be carried on into the future by a few of us who have used the tradition, not been used by it. At the same time John was making this work, he undertook a quest to develop a translucent porcelain clay body suitable for use by studio potters. Here's a selection of those pots made at Longlands. Translucency was crucial for him. A high-fired white stoneware did not qualify. But it was hard to support a family and make a living selling pots. Reeve found himself in an existential quandary and wrote, "One of the signs I see which tell me that my pots are still somewhat what I want them to be is that people are affronted by them and find it necessary to come to terms with them. They cannot just slip them into their world without any sort of consideration. I cannot reconcile myself to becoming a maker of nice things. That's why I'm so financially shaky. I know what to do to make it smoother for myself, but if I do it, it somehow takes away the whole point of my existence, and I might as well be back in Ontario selling nice engagement rings with my father." He turned to teaching at Farnham School of Art in Surrey, England, where he stayed for 6 years and worked quite closely with Henry Hammond. Then, in 1972, he received a grant to move his pottery operation back to BC. Reeve arrived to a solo show at the Vancouver Art Museum. While looking for land, he taught at the Vancouver School of Art and finished writing his book, A Potter's Way to Understand Glazes. Still in use by many potters, including this Canadian potter, Vincent Massey, and as I learned last week, Gwendolyn Yopolo. Meanwhile, back in England, Leach, now in his 80s and going blind, hoped that Reeve would succeed him in taking over the running of the pottery. A plan was hatched, and John was invited to be the studio manager, leaving Bernard's wife, Janet, as the business manager, and here they are beside the kiln in St. Ives in about 1974. It seemed a good match. John, a favored student, had a close relationship with Leach. Reeve's broad experience teaching, writing, and running his own pottery prepared him well. But as he poignantly described, it became apparent quite soon that Bernard was put in the impossible position of having two managers, one a wife and one a close friend, who gave him conflicting accounts of what was going on and how to fix it. It was an untenable arrangement, and after just 1 year, a sad parting between John and Bernard. Planning a fresh start back in British Columbia, Reeve and his family bought communal land in Roberts Creek, an hour's ferry ride up the coast from Vancouver. They built houses and studios. This seemed the perfect place for him to realize his vision. He named it Cold Mountain Pottery, after Gary Snyder's translations of a Tang Dynasty monk and poet named Han Shan. Han Shan was a wise man who wandered the countryside in search of enlightenment. Han Shan lived on Cold Mountain and took its name. There, his state of mind became Cold Mountain. This Zen concept appealed to Reeve. A contemporary of the Beat generation, he'd begun reading about Buddhism and Eastern mysticism in his early 20s. Later, he identified the spiritual aims of making pots as part of his secret agenda. This was one of his favorite books. Even though bricks for a large wood kiln were stockpiled in Roberts Creek, the kiln was never built, and the pots that were made for a short time at Cold Mountain Pottery had to be fired elsewhere. Like his alter ego, Han Shan, John was on the road a lot during this time. Well known in the ceramics community of the 1970s and 80s, he accepted invitations to teach and give workshops across the United States and Canada, leading some to say he was the ultimate gypsy potter. His system of marking his pots with 2 stamps, one to indicate where the pot was made and one with his own back-to-back open R symbol, provided clues for me to trace his nomadic path. He was a charismatic teacher, vividly remembered for talking not just about pots, but for wrestling with life's mysteries. People were attracted to this side of him, as well as to his obvious talent and passion for ceramics. He was a visiting artist at the Kansas City Art Institute in the mid-'80s and in 1975 when this jug was made. And here he's at a firing of Ken Ferguson's wood kiln with Warren MacKenzie in the middle. The 3 monkeys enjoyed each other's company. During Michael Cardew's 1976 North American tour, he convinced Reeve to drive him down the coast and help out at a legendary workshop he gave at Big Creek Pottery in California. This was an old dairy farm in the Santa Cruz Mountains run by Bruce and Marcia McDougall. And here's Cardew demonstrating at that workshop. It went so well that Reeve was invited back the following year in 1977 to lead an all-porcelain workshop with Warren. And as you can see, a good time was had by all. 30 participants, 3 weeks, 3 tons of porcelain. The experience led to a series of technical articles published by Reeve in multiple countries and mentioned by Mary earlier. These porcelain pieces were made by John at that time, and these a little bit later. At the age of 50, after 2 years teaching at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, Reeve concluded he was more effective teaching in a workshop format rather than a university setting. He and Donna were divorced by this time. His daughters were grown, and with fewer family responsibilities, he took a short break from ceramics while taking intensive meditation courses in California. But soon he was back to making pots, and throughout the 80s, he continued to produce classic stoneware forms like these, while working back and forth between studios in California, Denver, and Vancouver. And there were frequent visits to Warren's Stillwater Studio, which had become an important touchstone in his life. "We were like brothers," said Reeve. "We didn't have to explain ourselves to one another," MacKenzie told me. "John was the best pottery friend I ever had. We shared the idea that pots should be made easily and quickly. They should not be elaborate things. He was my best double." These teapots were made at MacKenzie's while John was teaching at the University of Minnesota. You can see some altered forms among them, and this was a technique he frequently used, as seen in these triangular-based teapots. Other forms often had rectilinear or exaggerated pedestal-like bases. Some are almost collapsing. Reeve loved the Southwest. In Denver, he joined Castle Clay, a cooperative group studio where he kept working in porcelain and stoneware, such as these teapots, and where he also embarked on what he called low-fire, high-color experiments, seen in the yellow pots at the bottom. This marked the beginning of another fertile period. Exuberant yellows and brilliant turquoise entered his palette. Their vibrant, playful spirit, along with Reeve's renewed interest in earthenware, harken back to explorations undertaken 20 years prior at Longlands. Now in his mid-50s, Reeve exhibited a freedom reminiscent of his younger days. And here he is in his Tina Turner t-shirt. I call these John's equivalent of a full sun jar, riffing on the Korean moon jar and John's love of puns. These were not brown pots. When I saw them for the first time, I was surprised and wondered, where did they come from? Later, when poring over hundreds of John's slides, I discovered a few images that helped me make connections that may or may not have been related for him. One here seems obvious. And this other one, taken in about 1972 in a market near La Borne, France, is the only picture of its kind in John's collection, but seems to have been significant enough for him to keep it all those years. These delicate porcelain cups, perched on sturdy earthenware saucers, are elegant to use. They recall some of the monochrome wares, like this yellow saucer dating from the Ming Dynasty. In 1987, John hit the road again, this time bound for New Mexico. Oh my goodness, 1 minute. He lived in the state for the last 25 years of his life and was instrumental as a founding member of the Santa Fe Clay, where he founded the studio-based program. Here's a selection of pieces made during his last years. Soft pastels grace familiar forms, and some new shapes appear, such as these tiny porcelains, inspired by this Yi Dynasty oil lamp. John died at home at the age of 82 in 2012. I'd like to finish up with these thoughts. For Reeve, making pots was a calling, and when throwing at the wheel, it was about his body, mind, and spirit being given fully to the experience. Sometimes quirky, sometimes cutting edge, his pots reflect an unorthodox stance, best described by Reeve himself when he said, "I'm not really interested in committing novelty upon the world, but only in making objects which have some hidden magic to them." Thank you so much for coming today.